On this day, 50 years ago, President Richard Nixon declared that
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
And so, Nixon started what is today known as the War on Drugs. The goal of this war has been to reduce drug use by cracking down on the production, distribution and consumption of drugs, with strict laws as well as incarceration of drug dealers and addicts. Most of Nixon's successors followed in his footsteps, with both Reagan, Bush Sr. and Clinton all escalating the war on drugs and the incarceration that comes with it. To this day, the US is still in a war on drugs. The skyrocketing number of overdose deaths and the war on drugs complicity in mass incarceration seems to be changing public opinion, with more and more people favoring more liberal policies opposed to the tough on crime policies of the 80s and 90s, and many are calling the war on drugs a failure. Almost 70% of Americans support legalizing marijuana, and a poll by the libertarian Cato Institute found that 55% of Americans support recategorizing drug offenses from felonies to being treated like minor traffic violations rather than crimes. 42% of Americans now live in a state where marijuana is legal, and Oregon has become the first state to decriminalize all drugs, even the hard stuff. Some are now seeing a new approach as the way to combat the drug problem in America, to stop looking at drugs as a criminal issue and instead as a public health issue. This is sometimes referred to as harm reduction. This approach also has something to do with economics. Here you have the basic supply and demand curve. Where they meet is the equilibrium, and it tells you how much of something is sold and how much it will cost. The idea behind the war on drugs is to decrease supply, and therefore the price goes up and less drugs will be sold. But this is leaving out a huge factor. Demand for drugs is not as price sensitive as other markets. Addicts will not stop taking drugs because they cost more, and an average person doesn't wake up one morning, see the price of cocaine is down and decide to get addicted. Meaning demand actually looks more like this. So when supply is decreased, it has a much smaller effect on price and the amount sold than in normal markets. The point behind harm reduction is to reduce demand for drugs through treatment, rehabilitation and prevention, which in theory has a greater effect on quantity sold than reducing supply. Let's look at a country that has taken this harm reduction and decriminalization approach. In the 80s and 90s, Portugal was going through a major drug crisis. As much as 1% of the population were addicted to heroin. By the late 90s, about half of the prison population were incarcerated for drug-related reasons. But the country realized that its laws were not stopping drug use. In 2001, Portugal decriminalized all drugs, including hard drugs like cocaine and heroin, and introduced harm reduction like access to clean needles and access to drugs that reduce withdrawal symptoms in people quitting opioids like heroin. It was still a criminal offense to sell and produce drugs, but not to possess drugs. Since this new decriminalization approach has been introduced, Portugal has seen a drop in frequent drug use, especially in young people, a drop in HIV and AIDS in people who take drugs, and a drop in drug-induced deaths. In 2015, Portugal had 6 drug-induced deaths per million people, compared to the US 312 drug-induced deaths per million people. Additionally, the percentage of incarcerated population who committed their crime while on drugs or to fund their drug addiction has fallen from 44% to 21%, more than a 50% decrease. This has been achieved with about a 60% increase in the number of people in treatment, while still saving the people of Portugal money, largely because of the reduction in incarceration costs. Now let's turn our view back home. America could follow in Portugal and Oregon's footsteps. We could decriminalize all drugs and decriminalize the 8.3 million Americans who are addicted to illegal drugs. The burden on police and prisons would also be lifted. 1 out of 5 people in prison are there as a result of a non-violent drug crime. Those sentences could be revised. In 2019, 1.5 million people were arrested for drug crimes. Of those arrests, almost 9 out of 10 were for simple possession of drugs. And drug arrests typically hit people of color hardest. Research has shown no statistically significant relationship between drug imprisonment rates and drug use. In fact, if prisoners are not offered quality drug treatment while in prison, they are far more likely to die from an overdose once they're released. You also need the second component of harm reduction: drug addiction treatment. Several studies have concluded that drug treatment is effective in stopping drug use and drug crime. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, for every $1 that is put into drug treatment, society saves $12 because of greater workplace productivity, fewer overdose deaths, lower healthcare costs, a reduction in crime, reduced spending on incarceration, etc. The cost of 1 year of imprisonment for one person is approximately $24,000, while the cost of methadone maintenance treatment, a common and effective treatment of opioid addiction, is only approximately $4,700 for one person a year. To summarize, Nixon started the war on drugs, and the next few presidents supercharged it. But lately, more and more of the public are turning against it. Portugal has successfully implemented harm reduction, and there is reason for the US to follow their lead. This most likely won't happen under Joe Biden, who doesn't support legalizing marijuana, let alone decriminalizing other drugs. But this might be an approach some states will try, or maybe a future president will implement it. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you another time.